Hello and welcome to The Point World Affairs. I'm Cha Sang-mi. U.S. President Donald Trump and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping have agreed to a 90-day ceasefire in the two countries' trade war during their sideline meeting at the G20 summit in Buenos Aires. Today we take a closer look at this uneasy truce and the long-term forecast of their dispute. For that, we have with us Professor Shin Se-don, Professor of Economics at Sookmyung Women's University. Thank you for joining us today again.
My pleasure always.
Let's first take a look at this short clip.
The meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping that were expected to greatly influence the future direction of the trade dispute took place on December 1st in Buenos Aires, Argentina. The two leaders met on the sidelines of the G20 summit and decided to temporarily pause their tariff war for the next 90 days.
I look very much forward to the dinner. I look very much forward to the discussion, and I'm sure discussions after. But the relationship is very special, the relationship that I have with President Xi. And I think that is going to be a very primary reason why we'll probably ending up getting something that will be good for China and good for the United States.
我们都承担着为这个世界和平繁荣的很大的责任。我们的合作才有利于推动这个世界的和平繁荣。
The U.S. has announced that it would scrap its initial plan to raise tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese products from 10% to 25% from next January, while China said that it will increase imports of U.S. products in the agricultural and energy sectors.
它不仅有效阻止了中美经贸摩擦的进一步扩大，而且为双方合作共赢开辟了新的前景。
What's more, China has promised to address issues like forced technology transfers, alleged intellectual property theft, and unfair trade practices in response to the three-month truce. And if the promises were to be unfulfilled within the time frame, China gave the U.S. the green light to further raise the tariffs as originally planned. The two countries reached a deal preventing the worst-case scenario of a full-scale tariff war, which was scheduled to happen from early next year. President Trump even commented on his way back to the U.S., saying that this deal will be one of the biggest agreements ever made if they were to be fulfilled. Back in July, Presidents Trump and Xi butted heads by harshly criticizing each other and slapping tariffs.
And the farmers will be the biggest beneficiary. Watch. We're opening up markets. You watch what's going to happen.
贸易战不可取，因为不会有赢家。 经济霸权主义更要不得，旗帜鲜明反对单边主义和保护主义。
However, the trade war between the U.S. and China is expected to slow down for the time being. On this week's The Point World Affairs, we discuss the intentions of both the U.S. and China and the direction of future negotiations between the two countries.
So, Professor Shin, how do you evaluate this truce between Washington and Beijing that is leaving the tariffs at 10%, right, not ratcheting up to 25%?
Well, it was pretty anticipated and highly expected. Was the meeting between the two presidents between the United States and China, but there has been many remarks after the meeting. Some people quote it as a punt or pause. Wait and see and ceasefire, but I think it was pretty unsatisfactory because we believed something kind of very specific agreements will be made between the two entities, but actually nothing has come out other than very specific and minor agreements. So generally speaking, it was a less than expected meeting between the two presidents.
So even though the overall outcome is a little bit disappointing, what are China and the United States both each getting from this 90 days deadline?
Well, China was able to get the hold on 25% on $200 billion export to the United States. until January 1st. So that was the first thing that China was getting from this agreement. Also, China has promised to buy more goods from America, and China promised to lower the tariff import from America. So that's what America has gotten. And in return, China, as I said, China was able to, halt a 25% tariff on on their exports to the United States from next year.
Right. How about for the world? Is this good for the world? How is this trade war ceasefire actually going to affect the global economy?
Well, we were pretty afraid, if America decided to go on with 25% tariff on $200 billion, export to the States, but that was put on a hold. So in general, I think the world economy has a little relieved because of the decision between the two party leaders. But it's just a ceasefire, and actually nothing has come. And I think one of the critical kind of limitation of this meeting is that America has to find out, that there isn't much for the United States to press. What they really want to need is prevention of intellectual property theft, and also government subsidy on some strategic industries for Chinese companies, and also China has been ambitiously trying to implement the Made in China 2025. So actually, America wants to some kind of restrictions on that field, but nothing has come out in that field. That's why I think America, in this kind of a table of negotiation, actually many people believe that China has won this battle and America has lost.
Okay, let's hear what other experts are saying about this.
The U.S. and China gave themselves 90 days of political breathing room after reaching a deal to effectively pause the trade war. It is good news for China, whose economy has been hit hard since the escalation of the tariff dispute. The U.S. also managed to land some sweet deals, with China saying it is further open to approving the previously unapproved deal for Qualcomm to acquire NXP Semiconductors. As a result, the two countries have created a reason to continue negotiations. But prospects are not all rosy. There have been cases where relationships have worsened even after a 6-month-long negotiation process, while many experts agree that the power rivalry between the world's two largest economies to take control of the international trade order will continue in the future. Just last month, both the U.S. and China clashed head-on during the APEC summit in Papua New Guinea. As a result, APEC failed to adopt a joint statement for the first time since its launch in 1993. Also, the fact that the Made in China 2025 initiative, which the Trump administration wants to eventually nullify, still remains as one of the key industrial policies of China, further dims fundamental reconciliation between the U.S. and China. In fact, Chinese President Xi Jinping has reaffirmed his commitment to realizing the so-called China Dream ahead of the trade talks with President Trump. Trump also commented that he may prefer maintaining the status quo with billions of dollars flowing into the U.S. as a result of a tariff dispute with China. We connect with experts from both the U.S. and China to hear their thoughts on the impact of the two leaders' decisions of a temporary ceasefire as well as future prospects.
We now connect to another expert in the United States, and joining us is Alan Carlson, Associate Professor in Cornell University's Government Department and a Director of China and Asia Pacific Studies program. Good to have you on, Professor.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you.
What is the assessment in the United States regarding this new deal reached at the bilateral summit?
It's certainly attracted a lot of attention. Clearly, there's no consensus yet in regards to the substance of the agreement. Upon further inspection, it's far from clear what the two sides actually agreed to. On the one hand, there has been a suspension of the enactment of additional tariffs that were going to take effect on January 1st. But on the other hand, it doesn't even seem that China and the United States agree as to what they agreed to. The specifics, for example, in terms of has China reached some sort of a deal on auto imports from the U.S. To reduce tariffs on them? Where fentanyl will fit into all of this is far from clear, and the president himself has been inconsistent in his messages. For example, he's talked about this being a great leap forward, which was an unusual choice of words, in the trade relationship, and celebrated it as being a big deal. On the other hand, he has appointed U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer to lead the negotiations, and he's taken quite a hardline stance previously. And the Chinese apparently were quite surprised that he's the one who's taking over the negotiations, and that has caused them some real concern.
And prior to this meeting with President Xi, President Trump has said that he was not very happy with engaging in these disputes and these talks with China, as the U.S. has raked in a lot of money from this trade disputes with China. Would you agree that U.S. has yet to lose anything from this trade war?
No, I wouldn't agree with that. I think the U.S. has already suffered some. For example, particularly when it comes to the farming sector, and especially the decline in Chinese imports of American soybeans. Those imports have basically gone down to zero since the trade war began. And so the producers, particularly in the Midwest, of that product have really seen a decline in their income. There's even some evidence that that was an issue which turned some voters in the midterm elections last month.
But then what makes you think that President Trump wanted to declare a ceasefire with China on this?
I think that the president always wants to look like he's a winner. And off of the midterm elections, it became a little bit harder for him to make that claim with the loss of seats of the Republican Party in the House. Going down to Buenos Aires at this period of time, while the markets were a little bit unstable, gave him an opportunity to meet with his Chinese counterpart. The Chinese, I think, also have gotten nervous and a little bit uncertain as to how far this trade war will go. And so they were willing to make at least superficial compromises and to talk a little bit of the language that the president wanted to see in terms of improving the U.S. China trade relationship. And off of that, then, Trump was able to get back on Air Force One and talk about a big victory. Economic analysts, though, suggest that actually a lot of the supposed progress that's been made as a result of this deal leaves us back where we started before the trade war began. Again, it's quite unclear what the end game is with any of this and the extent to which there has been a real breakthrough in the economic relationship.
Thank you. That was Professor Alan Carlson from Cornell University. Now, Professor Shen, what do you think about the comments of Professor Carlson? He actually also mentioned about the pros and cons of this trade war, but while the concern is not explicitly expressed in the U.S., they also must be worried about the global economy that is affected by this whole trade disputes and ceasefire.
Well, yeah, I agree with Professor Carlson's remark that it was a superficial compromise. That was definitely a superficial compromise. And also he mentioned, Professor Carlson mentioned that America has lost a lot in terms of exporting beans, agricultural products to the United States. And also most of the American consumers are feeling increased prices for most of the consumer goods coming from China. So actually there has been a lot of losses on the part of America, even though President Trump doesn't want to agree. Now I think Trump administration begins to realize the difficulty of breaking the deal with China. So that's, I think, very important, even though he mentioned that, he's pretty victorious in this negotiation with the President Xi. But I think in the inside of the president government, they are beginning to feel that it's going to be very difficult, and they try to find a kind of compromise, and hurriedly to end this kind of conflict against China. So I think sooner or later, I think the American government will try to end this kind of endless war between China and the United States.
How about talking about sectors? You know, this auto tariffs, especially the imported cars, were definitely an issue there, and also the agriculture, as you mentioned, soybeans. It's one of the most, pressing issue in the trade disputes. Some say that farmers are the biggest beneficiaries in this ceasefire. Tell us more about that.
Oh, well, about the auto tariff that China has been imposing. Initially, it was lowered. And right after American kind of tariff movements, China raised it to 45%. What China promised this time is they to make a lower a return to the previous kind of a stage. So it was not actually lowering tariff for the American, exporting cars to China. That's one thing. And second thing is that at this time, of course, China has agreed to import more from America, but there was no specific numbers. And China promised to increase the market for America in energy, in other industrial products, and as well as agricultural products, but there were no specific, date, timeline, or number or amount. So there's a lot of ambiguities in this agreement. That, I think, is the most crucial thing that we criticize. There has been nothing actually committed in this meeting.
Okay, let's hear what an expert from Hong Kong says. And now let's get more information. Joining me now is Victor Teo, assistant professor at the University of Hong Kong, who specializes in international relations in Asia Pacific. Welcome to our show again, Professor.
Thank you for inviting me.
China has promised to address issues like forced technology transfers, alleged intellectual property theft, and unfair trade practices in response to a 3-month truce in the trade war. Do you think that China will truly come through with the promises?
I think this respite is useful for both sides. To be honest, I think both sides are suffering from the consequence of this fight. And both the United States and China are not admitting any sort of loss or defeat, so to speak. But the Chinese, I think they are taking more of the hit than the U.S. because it actually has to do with the number of jobs being, when it's booming, it's created. Now when the factories are being shut down, there is actually an increase in unemployment. So the Chinese have to deal with this. So this is actually a good thing for the Chinese because they are given actually more time to organize domestically. But whether the Chinese will actually come through with what Trump wants, I think it's going to be difficult because what Donald Trump wants are actually structural changes, major changes to the Chinese economy, which even if Xi Jinping wanted and agreed with Trump, it would be kind of difficult to implement.
The U.S. is heavily criticizing China for its industrial strategy called the Made in China 2025 initiative. Do you think China will forego this strategy?
No, because it's the export-led driven strategy has been in place since the early 1980s. It's central to Chinese economic growth. So in order for China to switch growth model, like I said, this is a structural change. It's going to take a long time. So in order for it to be consumption-driven, so to speak, it would take the Chinese a long while. And the Chinese actually have to attain a certain standard of living in order to be able to do something like that. And even today, just look at South Korea and look at Japan. They still rely heavily on manufacturing. So I really don't see how the Chinese can switch overnight to give in to what the Americans want. And I think beyond that, this whole trade war is not just about addressing the few key points that you just mentioned. This whole trade war really is about the United States trying to deny the Chinese from becoming a real, comprehensive industrial power, and to, if you like, it's a strategic move. It's not just economic issues that are involved.
Some commentators are saying that this 90-day deadline will actually give China just buy some time for China. How do you think they will make use of this time?
I can't speak for what the Chinese government will do. I can only, provide an educated guess here. I think the Chinese will do their best to try and come to terms with, to offer some more olive branches to the United States. They really do not want to fight this trade war because I think the Chinese government really just want to focus on economic growth. They understand that a lot of what Donald Trump is doing is to, if you like, contain the rapid rise of China. The other important thing I think to understand is that Donald Trump is actually running for president again. So this has to do with his re-election campaign. He's actually never stopped campaigning. So Donald Trump is actually eyeing his re-election, and all the things that he's done so far, including the maneuvers with North Korea, also because of his gestures with Russia, has actually to do with China. So China has been in his sights from day one. What he's trying to get out of the Chinese is to get more favorable terms of trade. I think the Americans are realistic. They realize that the Chinese can't change overnight, even if the leadership agrees. There is no actual benefit if the US and the Chinese go on an all-out war. So what Donald Trump is trying to do is to maneuver the Chinese into a weaker negotiating position so that the Chinese will actually give him what he wants. Better intellectual property rights, buy more things from the US. And during this period when they have tensions, the US will sell weapons to every American ally in East Asia, and that includes Taiwan, because it's an opportunity time. So Taiwanese has just put in 2 big weapons purchase packages, buying a lot of weapons from the US. And particularly with the loss of DPP, this is even more critical. So the Americans have done a lot with South Korea and with Japan in the lead up to just before the Kim-Trump meeting. So after all this expenditure, the American arms makers, everybody who is manufacturing in America is happy. The voters in all the districts are getting all the, well, not all the jobs, but some of the jobs back. Or at least Donald Trump is seen to be doing something about this. So all this is actually done for his re-election campaign. And I think the Chinese understand this, and the Chinese hope that after his re-election campaign, he would actually tone things down and, resume normal relations with the Chinese.
Thank you. That was Professor Victor Teo from the University of Hong Kong. Professor Shin, what do you think about the comments of Professor Teo? China has been making promises to keep its end of the bargain. What do you think actually happened after this? And only this 90-day, as you said, period is not a solution to the fundamental problem. So how are they going to fix this?
Well, I agree with Professor Teo's mention that it's not just the economic matter, it's not just a trade matter. It was a kind of a struggle between 2 powers. America wants to put a drag on China's economic development. That's real intention, and China knows it. And China wants to delay American kind of pressure as long as possible. So we have to understand this matter as a kind of a political and global kind of a challenge between the 2 countries. Saying that, China has earned 90 days, but you have to read the agreement that there's no specific timelines between the 2. So there will be kind of talks, negotiations between the 2 parties, but China will be more relaxed because it is rather America who's running the time short. So they keep pressing, kind of, pushing China to end up with some kind of a compromise within 90 days. But China is pretty relentless in not giving any kind of a compromise. So the fight will be dragging on until next year. And I think sooner or later, America will find out that, this kind of a war is very difficult for the United States to win. So I think they want to, close this kind of a war, as soon as possible. So I'm pretty optimistic about the consequences of but the American challenge against China will be continued throughout next and on.
Okay, and so when we take a look at this short-term and long-term process of this whole,
war.
solving, yes, it's a war, definitely. So what do you think? What do you see as the biggest roadblock to this, solving this war issue?
Well, China wants the leadership of Trump begin to wither as time goes on, especially next year, because year after next is the election year. So we know that this election was lost on the part of Trump. So China wants, another administration. So they want to delay kind of a Trump kind of attack on China as long as possible. So there will be a very, very tedious kind of, a tug of war between China and the United States without any specific or concrete resolution or compromise. So it's going to be a very tedious war between the two.
Okay, we'll definitely have to keep an eye on the timeline and really what really goes on, the developments of these two countries. Thank you very much for coming today.
You're welcome.
The two countries have managed to avoid an escalation of the tariff dispute and bought themselves more time. The 90-day window of refuge will be crucial not only for the United States and China, but for the global economy as well. That's all we have for this week's The Point World Affairs. Thank you for tuning in and see you again next week.